What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing you a card discussion on Battle of the Elements. I love when a format gets to a point where people really start finding these really old cards that just happen to be relevant because of the way the format shaped up. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons, as always. So big shout outs today to Ryan. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So Battle of the Elements is a normal trap card dating all the way back to Ancient Prophecy, if you can believe that. And it has an effect that reads as follows. Activate only while all monsters on the field are face up. Both players send monsters they control to the graveyard so that they each control only one attribute. So, if this sounds a little bit familiar, it might be because there's another card that's actually, I would say, semi-viable in a lot of different formats that a lot of people like to experiment with in the main and the side deck, and that card is Goes in Match. Now, Goes in Match is essentially the continuous trap version of Battle of the Elements. So, you're probably questioning to yourself, why would I want to play a card that's only going to last me one turn when I can just play Goes in Match, which is going to be permanent and probably really put a stop to my opponent's plays? Well, that's what we're mainly going to be discussing in this video. We're going to be comparing it directly to Goes in Match and kind of talk about the upside of the fact that Battle of the Elements is not a continuous trap card. So, starting off with, why would you even want to play this card in the first place? Because it is a trap card, so the fact you have to wait a turn to set it before you can even use it, that's already a pretty inherent downside. But one of the biggest factors here with this card is that compared to other board types like Dark Hole, Regeki, or anything else that you might play, this card sends the monsters to the graveyard. It doesn't target them, it doesn't destroy them, it just sends them to the graveyard. So why is that beneficial? Well, Goki happens to be the strongest deck of the current format, and Goki extra linking you on turn 1 is a pretty popular play, and one of the biggest difficulties in playing against Goki is trying to out that extra linked board. Well, Battle of the Elements is a card that can help you do that because you've got stuff like Nightmare Cerberus, which protects everything from being destroyed, you've got Nightmare Phoenix, which protects everything from battle, and then you've got Nightmare Goblin, which protects everything from targeting, so your options for clearing their board are very limited. But since Battle of the Elements sends the monsters to the graveyard, it plays around the Cerberus, it plays around the Phoenix, it plays around the Goblin, it's really just a solid answer going up against these Goki boards. Now, you still have to play around the Trigate Wizard by baiting out Trigate Wizard's negation, otherwise this card is going to really do you much good. But at the very least, this card will bait out a Trigate negation because they have no other way to stop a card like this. So if you can either find a way to counter the effect of the Trigate Wizard or find a way to negate the effect that pretty much plays underneath the extra link board itself, then you're going to be in a pretty good position, because what the benefit here is that the extra link board is comprised of all monsters that are of all different attributes. Yeah, they might have like one or two that are the same, but it doesn't matter because you broke the extra link, which means that the Trigate Wizard will be offline, none of the co-linked effects of the Nightmares are going to be active anymore, and this is going to be the tipping point where you can start to take control of the duel. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Cimo, well, that's all well and good, but why don't I just play Sphere Mode at that point? Because Sphere Mode can be used on my turn, and Sphere Mode is going to allow me to do things in addition to breaking their extra link board simultaneously. And yes, I will give you that. Sphere Mode is probably a better option in that particular instance. But when it comes to Battle of the Elements, there is one thing that's rather unique about it, and the fact that you can use this card against a myriad of other matchups besides Goki. I would say 99% of the reason people are citing Sphere Mode is specifically because of Goki. Yeah, you could argue you might want to use it against Pendulum Magician depending on the board they're able to assemble, but even then, sometimes they don't even get 3 monsters onto the board that really makes Sphere Mode worth it. Battle of the Elements, on the other hand, while it is a turn slower before you can get it to go off, what's really nice here is that you have the flexibility versatility of this card to have it in your side deck, but also use it against other matchups. I mean, look at Trickstar Sky Striker. Sure, the Trickstars are all lights, but when they go to resolve a Scapegoat and start linking off into their extra deck with all their different link plays, the entire extra deck is comprised of monsters of all different attributes. So if you find the right opportunity to flip Battle of the Elements, you can completely wipe their board of maybe 2, 3, even 4 monsters. Their turn's probably going to come to an end because you've waited for that perfect opportunity. You might have had to give up 1 monster yourself, but basically to end their turn, that seems pretty worth it to me. I like the fact that you could pretty much use a board wipe on your opponent's turn rather than having to use it on your own turn, even though there are benefits to doing so. You also have to consider the fact that you can play Battle of the Elements in your main deck compared to something like Sphere Mode. Sphere Mode would never see play in the main deck because it's way too risky of a card unless the meta was so defined and so narrow that it justified playing Sphere Mode in the main deck, because most of the time it's just going to end up being a dead card. Battle of the Elements, however, depending on the type of deck that you're playing, naturally something like Paleozoic or Altergeist could play this, but even some other decks, like maybe even Trickstar Sky Striker or a pure Trickstar deck, or decks that have the room to play trap cards that might be comprised of a single attribute, you could make the argument that you could play something like this, and that's pretty good. And one of the interesting things about this is that the fact that it only lasts for a single turn actually has a really big upside, because that means you can play this card in a deck that doesn't necessarily comprise itself of just a single attribute. If let's say you're going against your opponent, like in the example I gave prior, and you just wipe their entire board of anything from Link monsters, to Trickstar cards, whatever it may be, the nice thing is that you wipe the board, but then when your turn cycles back around, you're not under the effects as if Battle of the Elements were a Gozen match, which now means you're free to do whatever the hell you want, and that's a really big advantage that this card has over something like Gozen match, just because you have the ability to play it in a deck that doesn't necessarily have cards that are all the same attribute, so you're not worried about when your turn comes back around if you can't advance your game state. That's one of the advantages of the fact that this card isn't a continuous trap, but there's also another advantage as well, and that's the fact that it's not really susceptible to spell and trap removal. One of the biggest worries when you're playing a Floodgate like Gozen match is the fact that if your opponent has something like a Mystical Space Typhoon, a Twin Twister, a Cosmic Cyclone, or any quick play effect that could disrupt the Gozen match from going off, then your opponent's going to chain it in response, the Gozen match will never resolve, and your opponent's just going to keep going off. Battle of the Elements, however, because it's not a continuous trap card, is not susceptible to that same sort of removal, meaning, yeah, sure, they might be able to chain cards in response, but that effect is going to go off one way or another, and I think that's very beneficial depending on the type of deck that you're playing. Now, this card does have its downsides, and I do want to discuss those as well. I think when it comes to Battle of the Elements, it's kind of like the fair compromise between Sphere Mode and Gozen match, whereas Gozen match and Sphere Mode kind of are better at doing one particular thing. Battle of the Elements kind of gives you the best of both worlds, while also having, I guess, the same kind of weaknesses as both cards, but it's a rather unique card in that instance because it can do a lot of things that the other card can't, and I think that's very beneficial when considering if you might want to play this card in your main or side deck. Another thing that's bad about this card, though, is that if you're already established, this card really does nothing. Because let's say, for instance, you're going first, you establish a board of maybe 2, 3, 4 monsters, and then you have Battle of the Elements. Well, the unfortunate part about that is this card isn't really going to do anything unless your opponent just wipes your entire board and starts trying to build their own. So it's not exactly like a proactively powerful trap, let's say in comparison to something like, I don't know, Solemn Strike or Solemn Judgment, to prevent your opponent from breaking your own board. It's more of like a reactive going second kind of trap, because it's actually not a bad card to draw, because even if you draw it going second, you can just set it, and then depending on the circumstances, when your opponent keeps doing whatever they're doing, you can flip this card, basically wipe their whole board aside from maybe one monster depending on the matchup, and then that's going to be a pretty good way to disrupt your opponent. I also like too that, you don't have to rely on your opponent summoning anything in particular particular, like say maybe Torrential Tribute, because if your opponent does target this card with, you know, any sort of removal, you can just chain it in response and wipe their board that way. Whereas Torrential, sometimes you're waiting for that optimal Torrential and then they decide to hit your back row and then that just wastes the card. So overall though, I think it's a really neat thing to see these old cards pop their head up every once in a while, especially when the format's in such a weird state that cards like this actually become very viable. Now, again, it's obviously format dependent, and if there's not really the need for a card like this, it's not really going to be played. But considering the fact that Goki's the strongest deck, and extra links are something you really have to worry about, this isn't really a bad option, and not to mention, it's a very cheap card nonetheless. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Battle of the Elements. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.